right, well, thank you everyone for coming this afternoon. My name is Walt Ackerman, and I am the Director of Administrative Services for Georgetown County. And the purpose of today's presentation is to talk about two different sales tax options that will be on the ballot on November 5th. They are in the form of referendum, so the voters, you will have to choose yes or no. Do you want these things to happen, or do you not want these things to happen? In my capacity as a representative of Georgetown County, and in an official setting like this, I can only educate you about these two sales tax referendums. I cannot advocate for the sales tax referendums. And I want you to know that, because if you have certain questions, I may not be able to answer them. It may seem like I'm evading the question, but I have to answer very carefully so that I'm not seen as advocating for the sales taxes, merely educating. So with that in mind, we're going to get right into it. And as I said, there are two different sales tax initiatives that you will see on the ballot in November. And I say November, but early voting actually starts October 21st. I would encourage everyone in the room, if you can, go vote early. It's a whole lot easier than standing in that line on the day of the election. So one of the first one that we'll talk about today is the local option sales tax. The acronym for it is LOST, which is the worst possible acronym they ever could have devised, because once you'll see how it works, you'll find out you haven't really lost anything. The next one is the capital project sales tax. That one's a little easier to get your mind around. The funds that are derived from the capital project sales tax are used to construct capital projects. Pretty easy, it's right in the name. So in the state of South Carolina, for those of you who are not familiar, there are 46 counties in the state of South Carolina. Georgetown is one of 46. Around the state, there are multiple different options for these additional 1 cent sales tax. 3 counties in South Carolina, and you can see them up on the map, that the ones not shaded in some color: Oconee, Greenville, both in the upstate, and then lonely little Georgetown down here on the coast. We are the only 3 counties in the state that currently do not take advantage of some form of additional 1 cent sales tax. We are literally surrounded by counties who do both of these local option sales taxes and capital project sales taxes. Some of them even have a third penny for education. So that's kind of a little bit of information that might be important. So when these sales taxes go on the ballot, the voters on an individual basis will decide yes or no, do I want them? One thing to keep in mind is a lot of items that you purchase today are currently not taxable. Those items will still not be taxable even if the 1 or 2 additional sales taxes are passed in November. The bulk of items that the normal everyday person purchases are things such as groceries. Groceries are currently not taxable items. Prepared food is, but groceries at the grocery store is not. Gasoline at the pump. There's a sales tax on gasoline, but it's a DOT tax and a federal highway transportation tax. There will not be an additional 1 cent sales tax on the gasoline that you purchase. Prescription medicine, no taxes on prescription medicine. Rent, house payments, doctor's office visits, things that you spend your money on, most of this stuff is not taxable, okay? And I think that's important for everyone to know. Now, the local option sales tax and the capital project sales tax as well, but the one we're talking about right now, local option sales tax, it is authorized under state law. And there's the statute, if you want to go look it up, Title 4, Chapter 10, Article 1, authorizes the local option sales tax to be put in place. And as with any state law, there's a whole lot of steps you have to take. Local option sales tax is much easier as far as the steps than the capital project sales tax. It's as simple as county council makes an ordinance that says, send this question to the voters in November. And then it's up to the voters to decide, yes, I want it, no, I don't want it, okay? The capital project sales tax, as we'll see, is a lot more complicated, but there's some rules and regulations that go along with how the notices have to happen and what transpires and what you can do. Just like I said, I can't educate, I can't advocate, I can only educate for this tax. So those things are in place. And then the important thing to know about local option sales tax is once it's in place, it's there unless it's rescinded by referendum. In other words, you have to vote it in, you also have to vote it out. And that's a kind of important piece to know. Someone in one of the public meetings that I was doing asked me, well, how in the world would I know going into the polls whether I was going to like this local option sales tax or not? So, well, that's a very good question. Remember back when we looked at the map, we are surrounded by people who have local option sales tax in place. If you know anybody in Charleston County, Berkeley County, Florence County, Williamsburg County, Marion County, any of these counties that have this, if you know somebody, call them and ask them if they like it or not. I told them, as far as I know, local option sales tax has been around for about 30 years. A lot of counties have had it in place. About 26 or 27 counties have it in place currently. It's been around about 30 years, and I don't know of any attempt to rescind local option sales tax once it's been put in place. And you'll see why, I think, in a minute, but once it's put in place, the taxpayers tend to like it. So this is what the ballot question looks like. And it's not really important to know the words of it. I mean, you can read it, but it simply says, should we impose the local option sales tax? I'm showing you this to show you the length of the question, okay? Because the capital project sales tax is like 6 pages. My worry is this ballot that we are fixing to undertake in November is very, very lengthy. You know, you got presidential elections, you got congressional elections, you got local state representative elections, you got county council elections, school board, all this host of different ballot questions are going to be out there, and I'm worried that people are going to get tired going through that ballot and not get down to the end to these questions. And whether you want to vote yes or whether you want to vote no, if you don't vote either one, your voice has not been heard at the polls. And I think it's important for people to go out and render their opinion at the polls. The other thing that worries me, and I was kind of blown away by this particular statistic, about 65% of the votes cast in Georgetown County are cast using straight party ticket. These items have nothing to do with party. It's not a Republican question, Democrat, Green Party, Constitution, whatever you want to call it. It's not, if you hit straight party ticket, you will not cast a vote for either one of these questions. So you have to scroll all the way down to the bottom of the ballot and get to these questions if you want to vote, okay? And I just think that's important, and I need your help spreading the word on it. Now, even though the process for local option sales tax is much simpler than capital project sales tax, the mechanics of it is very complicated. In the state law, it prescribes actually, exactly how this money is to be allocated. Now, what does local option sales tax do? 71% of the money derived from local option sales tax is going to directly offset, and I'll get to that in just a second, I'm sorry, wrong slide. 71% of the money collected goes to directly offset property taxes. So when you get your property tax bill, there'll be a separate line on it that says local option sales tax credit, and you'll see that deduction from your property taxes. Now, the numbers that I'm fixing to show you are based on an estimate of $10 million per year in collections, okay? We feel that's a very, very conservative estimate for quite a few reasons. From 2015 to 2019, it was a 4-year period, from May of 2015 to April of 2019, the county collected an additional 1-cent sales tax in the form of a capital project sales tax. When they entered into that, when it went to the polls in November of 2014, they were estimating they would collect $28 million. They collected $41 million over 4 years, so a little over $10 million a year. When I contacted the State Department of Revenue, and I keep pointing at that screen, this is why it's not working, I'm sorry. When I contacted the State Department of Revenue and got the numbers for what sales tax collections look like, I got them through all the way through from 2022 to 2023 by month. You can see how I did the calculation in the spreadsheet. In 2023, we would have collected almost $10,254,000 had we had one of these sales taxes in place. That number has certainly gone up since 2023. Tourism has gone up dramatically. A lot more people have moved into the county, so that number would have certainly risen. And then there's an unknown component in the sales tax report, because things that are purchased in counties that don't have a particular sales tax that would be applicable go into this big general pot. And it was actually 37% of collections statewide. So I really feel like $10 million is a super conservative number. So all of the data that you see me present, just remember that's a conservative estimate. Now, back to the allocation. Remember, 71% goes to offset property taxes. So if we collect $10 million a year, 7.1 million goes to offset property taxes. The other 2.9 million is going to be distributed to the counties and the municipalities. So Town of Pawleys Island, City of Georgetown, and Town of Andrews, and the county as a whole, based on a couple of different factors. But 71% goes to offset property taxes is the main thing to remember right there. Now, as far as the other part of the distribution, of the 71%, 67% goes to the county and 33% goes to the municipalities based on population, okay? Now, we only have 3 municipalities, Town of Andrews, City of Georgetown, Town of Pawleys Island, but the Town of Pawleys Island does not tax their residents' property taxes. And they only have about 150 residents anyway, so what they would get out of that would be very minuscule. The other portion, the 29% that goes to the county and the municipalities, can be used for things like new equipment, employee raises, maintaining facilities and buildings that we currently have and we need money to maintain. So that money can be used for long-term permanent things like employee raises, because it's, for all intents and purposes, permanent money. You know, it's not a one-time shot of money to do a one-time thing with. Now, on that 29% rollback, 50% of it is distributed based on where it's collected, and 50% is based on population. So we've got some estimates there as to what the county would receive and what the towns would receive as well. That's not the important piece. Here's the important piece. If I remember to point my clicker at the right place. What does this mean for the average household? So I have to take a look at averages. I can't look at everybody's in particular situation. So I looked at the average household in Georgetown County, and the average household income is a little over $59,000. When you back out what the average household spends on housing and transportation, medical cost, other things that are not taxable, that leaves you with disposable income, let's say, income that you could spend on, and food was the big one, other big category that's not taxable. So each household is left with a certain amount of money that they could spend on items that would be taxable. When you figure all this stuff out, the average household would spend about $58.18 in additional sales taxes each year. $58.18 per household. But that household could expect to receive a credit of almost $477 off of their property taxes. Now, it's not just your home. You also receive that on cars, boats, if you have an airplane, business, personal property, anything you get a tax notice on, that credit would be applied. So that's calculated in here as well. So if you're going to spend $58 and get back $477, your net household credit is going to be $418.65 on average. Now that's using an average house value of $200,000. And that was $199,800 is the average house value in Georgetown County. So, and we've got a method where I'll show you in just a second where you could find out exactly what your individual credit would look like. So what does that look like all across the county? If you live in the unincorporated areas of the county, you could expect a $477.37 credit. If you live in the town of Pawleys Island, and remember, they don't do property taxes, so they get the same credit as everybody else in the county, $477.37, and this is on a $200,000 house. It's probably a bad example for the town of Pawleys Island, but we're just going to stick with that $200,000 house. If you're in the town of Andrews, remember, they get an additional portion because they pay county taxes and town taxes. They can look for a credit of about $536. And if you live in the city of Georgetown, that credit would be $653.70 because of that additional portion that they receive. And they also pay county taxes and town taxes. Now, if you want to look at your individual situation, go out on our county website, gtcounty.org/lost, and right in the middle of the page is a link. And the link will take you to this spreadsheet. You can go in, the only box you can key anything in is that green box, and you go in and key your home value, go down and find your tax district, and it'll tell you what your credit would be based on those $10 million in collections, okay? Now, I keep pointing the wrong way, sorry. Randy, I think I turned it off. This is what the link looks like, okay? Now, I'm gonna back up just a second. Anybody that's sitting out yonder, and I can see one person who has an accounting background, he's out yonder and he's chewing on these numbers. People say you must be ignorant if you think the county's only, and this is question has been asked of me already, you must be ignorant if you think each individual household is only going to pay $58, but you're going to give everybody back $477. That math don't work. Here's the thing. The latest report that we have from 2022, and I can promise you it's a lot higher than this now. At the end of 2022, 40% of the sales taxes generated in Georgetown County came from tourists. We have a very high tourist base in Georgetown County. They come in, they buy a lot of taxable goods. They eat out at restaurants, they go to Wings and buy beach chairs and umbrellas and all this other stuff. They pay taxes on it. That's about 40%. I don't know the exact number, but there's a huge dollar amount that's derived from industrial sales. A lot of our industries make finished products and they sell direct to consumer. So one big example would be Safe Rack over in Andrews. You know, they make racking systems for warehouses. So somebody in Missouri is building a big, huge warehouse, you know, a big Amazon facility or whatever, and they order a bunch of racking systems from Safe Rack. That's a direct purchase. They pay sales tax on that, and that comes back into the Georgetown County pot. So that's why the numbers are so upside down. It's because of where that sales tax is derived from. That makes sense to everybody? Still doing it. They want to do it every time. All right, that was a lot of information. We went over it really, really quickly. Hopefully that spurred some questions. For the folks online, if you have any questions, if you will type them in the chat box. But anybody in the audience right now, you got a question? Yes, sir.
Make sure we show the text of the ballot. If yes or no is.
So a yes vote would say, yes, we want to put it in place. A no vote would say, no, we do not want to put it in place. And for those online, I'm sorry, I'll try to be better. The question was, he wasn't very sure whether a yes vote on the ballot would put the sales tax in place or not put it in place. So if we go back to that ballot question, it says, must the 1% sales tax, blah, 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 be put in place? Yes, it must, or no, it must not. So, and I have seen a sample ballot, and there is an explanation of that on the ballot instruction. So that'll be helpful when folks go to the polls as well. That's a very good question. Thank you. It would be every property that gets a tax notice. Yes. Yes. Right. Exactly. Exactly. Yes, it would. And the other big question that came up, and I want to address this. If we have someone in the county who receives homestead exemption, okay? The credit is based on the total value of the home, not the value minus homestead. So it would start with the higher number, then you would see the homestead credit and the local option sales tax credit on the tax bill. So it could have a huge impact to the seniors in the county that are already receiving the homestead credit. Any other questions? That was a great question. Yes, ma'am. Yeah, well, yes. Most people don't understand what that means, so we tried to simplify it. Yeah.
Assessed is the percentage.
Yeah. And right. Well, it's the full. It's not the market value, but it's the full appraised value, but not the 4% or 6%. It's the full value. So the way state law says the formula works is you take the total value of all the property in the county and divide it by the total collections, and that gives you this crazy little tiny small number that comes off of every dollar, and that's how it's calculated back. So it's a weird math, but you take the full value of the home. And outside of the county, outside of people who work for the county and work with taxes, most people don't really get that distinction. So good question though. Yeah. Anybody else? Yes, ma'am. I don't have a report on that, but I can just go back and look at some numbers that I've seen, what the residents pay, and then there's a big gap. So, I mean, I don't want to quote a number because I don't have an official report, but I have to do some estimation to fill that gap in, and it's a large number. Anybody else? Good question there.
I've been hearing
So in response to that, and again, educating, not advocating, okay? If local option sales tax is in place, and let's say the millage rate is the current millage rate where it is now, then you've got your taxes, you got your credit, and you got the net. If the millage rate doubles and you got no credit, you twice as bad. But if the millage rate doubles and the credit's in place, you ain't quite as bad. So, I mean, it's all about the net amount that you pay at the end to the fantastic folks down in the Treasurer's office. Yep. So the question for the online folks, and I'm sorry, I keep doing this, was there seems to be some trepidation out in the community. They worry, if the millage rate increases in the future, doesn't that kind of offset the credit that you would be receiving? Well, I guess, yes, it does, but if there's no credit there, then you wouldn't be getting anything anyway. So, you're just still paying the taxes. So at the end of the day, you have to look at what you're net paying, and that's what matters, is the size of the check that you write, I guess. All right, anything else on local option sales tax? And believe it or not, that's probably the easier one. It gets complicated from here. A lot less math, but the concept of this one is a little bit different. Excuse me. So just like local option sales tax, capital project sales tax is prescribed by law. But where local option sales tax, the process to get it to the polls is relatively simple. All it takes is an ordinance. The process to put capital project sales tax in front of the voters is much more complicated. In order to do that, County Council had to authorize the formation of a capital project sales tax commission. And the commission's responsibility was to go out in the community, seek input for project ideas, to then make a list to go on the ballot. They had a couple different things to do. They had to get the project ideas, they had to formulate the list, and they had to send the list and the completed question to county council. Now, once that took place, county council's only role, the only options that they could do was either say, yes, send the list as is. They could not change it. They couldn't add anything. They couldn't take anything away. They couldn't reorder anything. Send the list as is to the voters to let the voters decide, or no, we don't like the list at all. Don't send it to the voters. Obviously, county council decided to let's send it to the voters. So now it's in our hands to go to the polls and vote on this thing, either yes or no. So the process was a lot more complicated. Now, I mentioned earlier that the county had undertaken a capital project sales tax initiative. It was voted in 2014. And so collection started in May of 2015 and they ended in April of 2019. It was a 4-year process. And that was happening all over the state. Capital project sales tax was kind of new at the time. And after a couple of rounds of it, the people in the state legislature heard back and realized that there was a lot of problems going on with the way it was being done. Remember earlier when I said county council estimated they were going to collect $28 million over 4 years and ended up collecting 41? Well, at the time, there was no mechanism to determine what to do with all the extra money. So they just sort of had to make it up as they went, and they came up with different project ideas, but those weren't ideas that were necessarily approved directly by the voters because they were not on the list. The state legislature said, we don't want that to happen again. So the commission that was formed had to generate 2 lists. They had to generate a priority project list and then a contingency project list in case you had more money than what you anticipated getting. So now all projects would go before the voters, and your contingency list needs to be way bigger than the money that you think you're going to have. That way you don't run into a problem, because this thing is going to go for, on the question, is asking to put it in place for 8 years. 8 years is a long time from now in our world. If you look back from 2020 to now, imagine what could happen in 8 years. That can be a very long time. So the commission formed those 2 lists. And they sent it to county council, and county council said, it's a pretty good looking list. Let's send it to the voters to see what they think. So that's where we are now. Now, the important thing to remember is even though there's 2 lists, one is a priority list. So those items have to be done before the items on the contingency list are, it might not have to be done, but they have to be funded, let's say. So the priority projects have to be funded before the contingency list projects are funded. That's important to note. And one thing that the commission figured out when they were doing it, and you'll see, and I'll talk about this in a minute, but a lot of projects that were submitted had potential grant money associated with it. Okay, there's a huge potential. We're pretty sure there's going to be grant money, but it's not confirmed yet. We don't have the grant award in hand, and the commission felt like if it was an item that was on the priority list without a confirmed grant, then it had to be fully funded, which is according to state law. So any item that had a grant, most of those were, unless it was something that they felt like was very important, most of those items went down on the contingency list. The best example of that, the first item on the contingency list is a $36 million project to dredge Murrells Inlet, but we need $1 million to go along with the grant. The commission didn't feel like we could fund the other $35 million if the grant didn't come through, so that's why it's on the contingency list, if that makes sense. Now, the commission, and you'll see when you start looking at these projects, the commission heard from a lot of different groups. We call them sponsoring entities. So it might have been a member of the public that came to a meeting and said, hey, I'd like to see this done, but they had to go to some governmental entity Town of Andrews, City of Georgetown, Georgetown County itself, Georgetown County Water and Sewer, Browns Ferry Water, Rural Water, one of these governmental entities, because ultimately this is a public project and some public entity is going to be constructing, operating, and maintaining this public project. So they had to go to those folks. They had to put together the project proposal so that we could have some more accurate project proposals, and then they brought them back to the commission. Now, when the commission started receiving these projects, remember we have 8 years, $10 million a year, $80 million. Well, we got 200-something million worth of project proposals, so they had to come up with a way to prioritize it, to figure out which projects went on which list. So they came up with a weighted scoring method, and they prioritized health, safety, and wellness above everything else. So projects that improved the lives through some health, safety, or wellness initiative scored a little higher than projects that did not. Projects that benefited the county as a whole scored a little higher than projects that only benefited one small part of the county, okay? And that's kind of how they looked at things. And then there was a big effort to make sure that people understood just because we have the money to build something doesn't mean we necessarily will have the money to maintain it for the next 30, 40, 50 years. So ongoing maintenance was a big concern, and projects that had excessive ongoing maintenance with no method of funding that maintenance scored lower than projects that didn't necessarily have that. Now, and I didn't advance my slides, I'm so sorry. Oh, I went the wrong way. That was this slide I just talked about. Now, the other thing when generating the list that the commission really considered was the order of projects that were listed. They wanted to put projects up near the top of the list that were relatively easier to do, smaller in dollar value, because remember we're getting $10 million a year. They were a little bit smaller in dollar value, and so they wanted the public to be able to see some things happening relatively quickly, and that's why the list is ordered like it is. One of the most important projects to the commission, and actually a project that is ranked as the highest health priority in the state of South Carolina by DHEC, is the Sampit Sewer Project. But that's number 9 on the list. The reason being, sewer is so complicated and complex to get done. It's a lot of engineering, it's a lot of permitting, it's a lot of prep work. It's going to be 18 months to 2 years before they can even start digging dirt. And the commission didn't want to put that as the first project because we have to, remember we also pay as you go, so we have to collect the money first and then start, and it'd be 2 to 3 years before anything happened if we were waiting on that particular project. So they put some smaller projects up front, things that can get done relatively quickly. While we're waiting on the collections for the Sampit project, it should take off right on time, just judging by the speed of things. So how does all this work? And I mentioned this a minute ago. This is an 8-year endeavor, right? We're going to collect the money for 8 years if this passes. If it's voted on in November, I'm calling that year 0. Collections don't actually start until May of 2025. That would be year 1. In the second Y1 you see up on the screen, that's July of 2025. That's when the county would receive the first check from Department of Revenue. Collections happen in May. Tax returns are due by June 20th. DOR processes them. The county would get a check sometime, hopefully at the end of July, would be the first check we get. That's really when we can start these projects. So if you look at how the whole thing works and look at my little windy path, if this is an 8-year endeavor, the final project may not be completed until 10 years after we actually vote on it. So it's a long-term thing. So some of these things are going to be hanging out there for quite a while. There is a way to shorten that up a little bit, and I'll talk about that in just a minute because it's actually part of the question. Now, what type of projects are on the list? Remember, they prioritized health, safety, and wellness. The commission prioritized health, safety, and wellness. So about $42 million of the priority list, and this is the only priority list projects, 42 million are water and sewer projects, health, safety, and wellness. You know, the biggest one, the biggest single project being the Sampit Sewer Project, that's about 13 million. It's a very aggressive sewer project. It's pretty neat how they designed it, but it's a long, extensive project that goes way on down Powell Road all the way from 521, because that's where it has to hook into. We've got about $10 million worth of stormwater projects. The biggest single project in that group is a big drainage project up in the Parkersville community. I think it covers all of MLK in the Pawleys Island, Waccamaw Neck area. And then there's some stormwater drainage projects in the city of Georgetown, some others up in Pawleys Island, total about $10 million. Public safety, another huge initiative. Remember when I said they prioritized countywide impact? So there's a project on here, it's $10 million for a new 911 center and EOC facility. Anyone who's familiar with our current facility, you would know it's in a flood zone. And when we have storms, sometimes we can't even get to the EOC. The other part about 911, that building's very old. It was designed back when Georgetown County had about 40,000 residents. Well, we got 65,000 now and we're growing, and we don't have any more space to sit another 911 operator in that room. So there's just nothing else we can do with the space that we have. We're going to have to do something eventually. The other big public safety project is a new fire station up in the Midway Fire District, and there's a fire station here in the city of Georgetown. Transportation projects, there's a $1 million project that is in the city of Georgetown, but it's going to be done by DOT. It's widening of Black River Road. That's going to coincide with a big project the hospital has going to put some walking paths and exercise stuff on the hospital campus. But that's actually a $6.5 million project, but $5.5 million of it is funded by a DOT grant. The city has to come up with $1 million to relocate utility lines, and then DOT is going to do all the rest of it. So the commission, that actually helped this project score a lot higher as well. The commission looked and said, hey, if we have grant money in hand, that stretches these capital project sales tax dollars, and we can get more work done for the same amount of money. On the water and sewer side, the town of Andrews has a $6.2 million project. They have a 90% grant in hand. They need $620,000 to do this $6.2 million project. The commission felt like, hey, this is a fantastic use of CPST dollars, and it's health, safety, and wellness. That project scored very, very high. The other project in transportation is also another grant-related project. Waccamaw Regional Transit Authority wants to build a bus terminal here in the city of Georgetown. If anyone is familiar now where folks get picked up, it's over between the Piggly Wiggly and the cleaners, and they sit on the side of that building. There's no restroom facilities. They can't get out in the weather. If it's hot, cold, raining, it doesn't matter. They have to sit there while they're waiting on the bus. This would provide some space inside where they can sit in out of the weather, have some restroom facilities, things like that, and probably like a covered shelter where the bus pulls up and picks them up. That is a $600,000 ask, and they have grant money to finish out. They got $2.4 million worth of grant money to finish that project out. Recreation, there's 3 different recreation projects, 2 up on the Waccamaw Neck. One would actually tear down and replace an existing park up on Wachesaw Park. And the other would put some outside courts up near there's a big space out by the current recreation facility, the regional rec center up in Waccamaw, and the other is a big covered area up in Pleasant Hill at the baseball park there in Pleasant Hill. There's currently no covered area there, so it's just be like kind of like the thing, if you're familiar with the area behind the library in Andrews, it's just a big covered shelter with a concrete floor and a little wall around it. It would be like a picnic area you can use for family events, but it would also be lined with pickleball court lines and basketball court lines and things like that, so it can be a recreation or a multi-use type area. Public services facilities, one of these is a county project. They need a covered space out at the landfill to work on big equipment. Currently we don't have anything. They have to just work on it in the rain, the lightning, the whatever, in the mud. And this is, 100,000 pound bulldozers and huge tracos and things like that. The only other option they have is to try to put it on a truck and haul it down the road to somewhere, which is not very conducive. It takes time and money to do all that stuff. So that would be a facility there. And then in town of Andrews, they have a very dilapidated building that currently they can't put anything in because the roof is in bad shape. It's some old building that was part of the National Guard Armory, and we're going to tear that down and build a metal structure to house some of their equipment for water and sewer in. That's kind of how those projects shape up. Now, I've mentioned a couple of times before that these projects will be pay as you go. So we got to collect the money before we can do the projects, or at least collect a part of it enough to start the project. We got to know what we've got coming in order to fund these projects. So, and they have to be funded in the order that's listed on the ballot. So you can't start with number 22, you got to start with project number 1. So the order is very important as well. All of that can be set aside if we issue bonds. So there's a part of the ballot question that says, does the county have the authorization to issue bonds only for the county-sponsored projects? So that would be the EOC 911, that would be the Parkersville Drainage, the Midway Fire Station, the covered facility out at the landfill, and I think that actually might be it. It's about 23 million of the priority projects. They're looking for authorization to issue bonds. That's not a direction to issue bonds, but that's authorization. Now, you say, why in the world would we do that? What sense does it make to borrow this money? We could beat inflation. We have the potential to beat inflation. If you go back and look, this 10-year initiative, construction inflation runs about 5% a year. So we had to leave a lot of room. If you add it all up, there's only about $73 million worth of projects on the priority list. We think we're going to collect 80 million. So we had to leave some room in there for inflation. Now, the county, their finance department, they do a real fantastic job. We watch our pennies. We do good reporting. We have good budget policies. County council does a good job. With that, we have a AA- credit rating. And what that means is we can borrow this short-term type money for about 3%. So if inflation is 5 and you can pay 3% in interest, you're actually getting more bang for your buck. You're stretching your dollars a little bit further. Now, if the interest rates change, if the whole market changes and it doesn't make any sense, then county council wouldn't have to borrow the money. This part of the question just says, we authorize you to borrow the money, yes or no. And I know there'll probably be some questions on that. Now, in the last capital project sales tax initiative, certain things were not necessarily done in the best manner that they could possibly be done, and there was a lot of heartburn behind how things went down, and some of it's actually still hanging out. In order to combat that problem, because we know a lot of people would have some trepidation voting for it if it's just going to be the same old, and if you remember when I talked about the state legislature changing, saying we had to make 2 lists, they also put another change in state law that says you have to be audited by DOR. So you have to have all your documentation in order, and that means the county has to have the documentation in order, because DOR sends the county the checks, and then we send a check out to the project sponsors. So we want to make sure that they're doing the right thing. So in the ordinance that county council passed, that's sending this to the ballot, it says if this passes in November, before any money is given to a project sponsor for a project, they have to enter into a funding agreement. And what that funding agreement does is it puts some restrictions on what they can do. First thing they have to do is give the county all of the plans and the drawings and the renderings and the specifications for what they're going to send out to bid, and the county will match it up and make sure it's the same project that was submitted and went on the referendum. That's number one. The second thing they have to do is they have to bid these projects out according to the most restrictive of either their procurement policy or the county's procurement policy, whichever one has the tightest controls. After all that is said and done, they have to turn all the bids in and the bid award letters and all that good stuff. The county will review it and say, okay to proceed if everything's in order. Then they can start the project. We're not just going to write them a check and say, here you go, do the project. They're going to have to submit invoices to us that we will match up to all those bid packages and specifications and drawings. And we'll say, yep, that's good. Here's a check to pay those invoices. They'll pay the invoices. But before they get any more money, they have to bring us not only the new invoices, but proof that the previous invoices were actually paid. They have to bring us the canceled checks. We're going to need all that for the the Department of Revenue audit, the DOR audit. A county not very long ago failed to provide all the required information. They currently have a CPST going on, and they didn't dot the I's and cross the T's, and they did a project that wasn't on the list, and they had to stroke a check for $18 million back to DOR. We don't want to have to write that kind of check. I think I'd have a heart attack writing that kind of check. Just saying. Well, Phil would at least anyway. So that's how we're trying to overcome some things that weren't necessarily done in the best way on the last CPST initiative. Now, getting down to the question. You remember the local option sales tax question? And it basically filled up one screen, okay? This is just the introduction. This is the preamble to the capital project sales tax question. And it simply says, should we put this capital project sales tax in place for the following purposes? And here's the following purposes, and we have to list every single one of these things on the ballot. So it goes on and on and on, which is why I say we got to get the word out and tell people, if you intend to vote, you have to make sure you scroll all the way down and get to that part where it says yes or no. Because if you just get tired of it and walk away, you have not cast a vote. It's a non-vote. Your voice will not be heard at the polls if you don't select yes or no. Now, we have to list, by state law, we have to list every single project, what the purpose is, and the dollar amount. So, and we thought, since the county's not doing all the projects, it would make good sense to put the project sponsor. So just like you see, the first one is Browns Ferry Water District. This is almost $3 million, a little over $3 million for some water system upgrades and improvements. The commission felt like this was a good one to put first up on the list because they're currently doing a USDA project. This would just continue that right on. It's shovel ready, it's ready to go. The voters could see some initiative right out the gate. Then you go down the list, we got City of Georgetown, that's the road widening project on Black River Road. The important thing to see is City of Georgetown, $1,040,000 as grant match funding. And you'll see that through several of these. So that's anyone that has a grant attached to it, you'll see as grant match funding. Now, there are a lot of projects that have the potential for grants, particularly water and sewer. There's so many different avenues for water and sewer projects to get grant money, but nothing's guaranteed yet. So, and you know, we're pretty sure that's going to happen, but we don't know how much and we don't know when, so we didn't want to count on that. But for every grant dollar we get, that allows us to get deeper into the contingency list, which is why the contingency list is so extensive. But if you look, and I mentioned before, the Sanford Sewer Project, very high profile project, very much needed. The community is in dire straits from a sewer standpoint. It's number 9 on the list, but if you go and add up those first 8, it's a little less than $10 million, which is less than 1 year of collections. And remember, it's going to take 18 to 24 months to get the Sanford Sewer Project off the ground. So while we're waiting to start to do all the permitting and all the other stuff that goes along with that project, we can be doing some of these other projects. But you scroll down through that list and look, there's some fantastic projects on there. That was kind of the hard part for the commission, was there was no real bad projects. You know, you couldn't just, out of the 60-something projects that were submitted, there wasn't anywhere they could say, well, this is just stupid, and they threw it out. We couldn't do that with any. They were all very much needed, very good, well thought out projects, but they had to come up with some way to whittle that list down to a manageable number. But 22 items on the priority list, and you can see I mentioned the Murrells Inlet dredging, first on the contingency list for $1 million on a $36 million project. We actually currently have some of that grant money in hand. We have about half of it in hand already. We're just waiting on the other part, but we don't know when it's coming, so we couldn't put it on the priority list. 19 items total on the contingency list. And then we move down to the final part of the question, and this concerns the bonds that I talked about earlier. Given the county the authorization, should they see the need to issue those bonds, we'd issue the bonds, do all the county projects all at one time, and then use the CPST money to pay the bonds back in a very short period. So this would actually be a revenue bond, not a general obligation bond, because it's a special source revenue. And again, down at the bottom, yes or no. And you can see in that part of the question, it actually says authorizing the county to issue up to $25 million for county-sponsored projects. So we wanted that to make that very, very clear to the voters as well. Now, again, check yes or no. You know, you gotta let your heart be your guide. That was a lot, and I've talked for a long, long time. Does anybody have any questions? Anybody online have any questions, or anybody in the room have any questions? I must have did a better job with this one than they would have lost, because no hands shot up immediately. Yes, ma'am. So the question was, how did the commission determine which part of the county got on the priority list? So when all of these projects were submitted, and like I said, we're looking at $80 million in collections, and we got $200 million worth of project submittals, a little over $200 million worth of project submittals. So the commission had to come up with some sort of method to prioritize these items. They had a scoring sheet that they developed, and that score sheet is actually out on the Georgetown County website. If you go to gtcounty.org/CPST, you can see exactly how that score sheet worked. So different items had different weighted scores. So projects were scored on a scale of 0 through 9, okay? And there was some emphasis behind how the 0 through 9 was scored, and then they were weighted based on several different factors. So health, safety, and wellness received a higher weighting factor than some of the other things. The grant money associated with a project gave things a higher weighting than some of the other criteria. So at the end of all of it, the scores were totaled up from the 6 different commission members and averaged out, and that's how the projects ended up being ranked on a priority list basis and a contingency list basis, or a didn't make it on any list basis. Now, within that, the commission then shuffled some of the projects around to better fit some timelines. That's why the first 8 projects you see are kind of some of the smaller projects, things that can be done a lot quicker, whereas the commission actually felt that the most pressing project was probably the Sampit Sewer project, because it impacts so many people on a health, safety, and wellness basis, but it just takes so long to get it off the ground, it didn't make any sense to put it as the very first project. Yes, ma'am. Hope that answers that question. Anybody else? Yeah, the grant award has been received. Yes, sir. There's a lot of other projects on the list that, particularly, let's say Georgetown County Water and Sewer, because there's so many different grant opportunities for water and sewer projects. They feel super confident that some of these projects will receive additional grant money, particularly the Sampit Sewer, the Oatland Sewer project, some of these other water projects, but there's no grant award yet in place. And with water and sewer grants, you can't put in for them, but so far ahead of time. Not knowing whether this money is going to come in, they can't even apply for the grant because they don't know that they're going to get the project. The worst thing with a grant that you could actually do is submit for a grant award and receive the grant award and then turn it down because you couldn't do the project. You know, that kind of puts you on the bottom of the grant list the next go around. So you want to make sure that you've got your ducks in a row before you submit for that grant. So let's take the Sanford Sewer project, for example. $13 million project, it's on the priority list. If we end up getting, say, $3 million in grant money, that's $3 million more contingency projects that can be done. That's why the contingency list exists. It's for what happens when you have more money than you think you were going to have. So we're estimating 80 million in collections. If we collect $100 million, that's what the contingency list is down there for. We just roll right down that list. So the more money we get, the deeper down that contingency list we can get. And if we're lucky enough, we'll get all 19 of them. I don't think we'll be that lucky, but we can all hope. Yes, sir, in the back. I like to kill two birds with one stone. There you go. Anybody else have a question? No bad questions, y'all. Ask them if you got them. Speak now, forever hold your peace. I'm just kidding. Well, there was a lot of thought initially to add on over at the detention center a new 911 center, but the cost for the detention center went up so much. If you know, recently we had to go to a council meeting and they actually pared that project back because we ultimately didn't have enough money to finish just the initial detention center project. So we didn't have enough room in the bond to do a 911 center. But that's a very good question. Anybody else? Yes, sir. That's a very good question. So if the capital project sales tax does not pass, and before I answer that question, I just want to remind everybody, capital project sales tax collections work just like local option sales tax collections. 40% of it is coming from tourists. Another huge chunk is coming from industrial sales outside of the county. If these projects do not pass, there's none of these projects that are fluff, I would say. You know, you might could say one or two of these items, well, you know what, if you didn't have them, the world's not going to end. But all of these projects are fairly critical to some degree, and we're going to ultimately have to try to figure out a way to pay for these projects. That way is ultimately going to be issuing debt in the form of GO bonds and raising taxes to pay for the debt. So that's the only other method there is to pay for it. That is a fantastic question. Thank you. Anybody else?
Walt, I've already answered this question in the chat, but just for everybody's, remind everybody, we did have a question. Where is the location of the website calculation sheet? If you would please.
That would be gtcounty.org/lost, LOST. And that link is right kind of dead in the middle of the page, about a third of the way down. Good question there.